The whole region is definitely watching these trade talks closely. They've been extended a number of times now for 3 additional months while the U.S. and China figure out sort of a more permanent arrangement for tariffs. I think that definitely will be high U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, but we don't know the final outcome.
Yes. Now, the White House says this gives both countries more time to address trade imbalances, referring to, I suppose, the U.S. trade deficit with China. What other levers are there to pull besides tariffs, especially for the U.S.?
Well, each side has been threatening the other with various, types of pressure, I suppose. China, of course, as you know, threatened to cut off rare earth and minerals for the U.S. The U.S. has been adjusting the various controls on exports of semiconductors to China, such as NVIDIA's H20 chip. So each side has a lot of leverage over the other one. I would say perhaps since the Chinese trade surplus with the United States is so large, ultimately the U.S. might have a bit more leverage, and Trump is certainly going to use that as much as he can.
Yeah, so how do you see discussions between China and the U.S., as you mentioned, with 3 months now, advancing when it comes to those few sticking points that you mentioned? There was the chip exports, but also rare earths, and also the fact that China is also still buying Russian oil.
Yes, there's so many issues that could be put on the table. And for example, TikTok, the social media app that is widely used in the U.S., even though it was banned by Congress, Trump has allowed it to continue operating in the U.S. There's the South China Sea, there's the port deal in Panama, and the list just goes on and on and on. So the question is how many of those issues the U.S. and China really want to put on the table for some sort of more permanent and comprehensive solution. And I think some of them might get, for example, the TikTok one keeps getting delayed. That might get delayed further.
Yes. And what might other countries that have been highly tariffed by the Trump administration be reading or studying from how China has been dealing with Washington?
But China is one of the few countries that has really threatened and carried out at one point retaliation against the United States. The European Union sort of considered it. They studied various options, but ultimately they accepted a 15% tariff on European goods to the United States and did not retaliate by, for example, putting a 15% tariff on U.S. goods or banning the import of bourbon or, I don't know, American cheese or something like that. They just sort of accepted it. Whereas China took a harder line when Trump raised tariffs at one point as high as 145%. China went up as high as 125%. And so it showed a little bit of a harder line, but ultimately they're ending up in a place that might be somewhat similar to these other trading partners.
Yes, and you spoke about the chip makers and the producers, AMD and NVIDIA. They are agreeing to pay the U.S. government 15% of their Chinese revenues. How unprecedented is something like that? Because 15% does represent a huge chunk of revenue.
Yeah, I was flabbergasted and had trouble understanding it when I first heard about this arrangement. It's highly unusual and even potentially illegal. I mean, I think the Trump administration and officials in Washington will work with NVIDIA and AMD to figure out some way that the courts will okay, or that maybe can avoid a court battle to get this 15% surcharge, or I'm not sure how to describe it, this 15% charge accepted and applied. But a lot of details still need to be worked out.
Yes, of course, these companies were previously the target of security concerns in Washington. So has this either been resolved, or was it simply an excuse by the Trump administration to gain trade leverage over Beijing?
It certainly is a source of leverage, and I guess Trump has changed his mind a couple of times on not only on this issue but on other issues. So at any point in the future, he could say, if China does something he doesn't like, you know what, I allowed the export of these H20 chips with the 15% charge, but now I've changed my mind, and you're not getting them after all, and maybe other U.S. technology could be cut off as well. So it's certainly a lever that he can pull at any time to threaten Beijing, and then Beijing may retaliate with its own levers.
Yes, and we've already seen, it's been documented quite widely that these tariffs are hurting U.S. importers and ultimately customers, but little about the impacts on the Chinese producers and exporters. What's your assessment of how the existing and prospective tariffs are hitting China's economy?
It's hard to say right now. We looked at the trade statistics that just came out a few days ago, and the China's exports were up on the whole. They were down to the U.S. and have been down for 3 or 4 months now, quite sharply. But exports to every place else in the world are mostly up, and overall exports are up. It could be because some products are being diverted through third countries and are ultimately ending up in the United States. It could be because the Chinese exporters are developing new markets. But the Chinese economy does not appear to have been severely damaged by the tariffs yet, but it's still quite early, and it may take some time for the impact to really filter down. And also the U.S. is threatening to block these transshipment cases. So if the U.S. enforcement gets tougher, then China might feel the bite more.